Welcome back. Now, here's more of our interview with the Brazilian ambassador to the United States, Sergio Amaral. If you look at Asia, how big a priority is Asia for Brazil? There's a very influential online publication called The Diplomat, which pointed out that Asia is being overlooked by the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It uses one measure, staffing levels at your embassies in Asia, and says they're not at the same levels as the embassies, say, in Washington or London or Paris.
Yeah, I think we cannot say that about Beijing, because the embassy is quite big. It has been increasing. I think Asia plays a more and more relevant place in Brazilian foreign policy. And we have already important relations with China. It's our first trading partner. We have had for a long time strong relations with Japan. Japan is an investor. We have a big community of Japanese people in Brazil. I don't know whether people realize that we are almost 2 million people from Japanese descent, mainly in São Paulo. But there is one point which I think applies to many Asian countries, is that we are complementary. We are complementary in the sense that we have perhaps what they don't have, which is water and land. This means agriculture. And on the other hand, we are importers of technology and some sophisticated manufacturers. This fact alone plays a central role, because either we like it or not, and we like it, well, our relations with Asia tend to increase even more.
So the way of looking at that is that you export primary resources to Asia and you import manufactured goods. Do you want to change that?
Yes, for sure. We would like to export more value-added products to China, and we are working in that direction. And I think part of the problem is our problem of competitiveness, but we are trying to find out a solution for that, increasing investments in productivity and in technology products. The other side, however, in some cases may be a kind of a tariff escalation in which the primary products we export pay 2–3%, and as far as we increase the value added to the products, they pay a much higher tariff. That's the case of, for instance, of soya that we export to China and many other countries. And this we probably will negotiate in order to have better conditions.
Now, China's signature international development project is the Belt and Road Initiative. It extends to Brazil as well. China has invested in the development of ports, airports, the energy sector in Brazil as well. What impact is that having on your country?
I was the chairman of the China-Brazil Business Council, and we made the first more thorough survey on Chinese investments in Brazil. They have been growing. In a space of 4 to 5 years, there were $30 billion of Chinese investments, and of course that's positive for the country, and we welcome that. Whenever these investments may not be in the interests of the country, just simply say, for instance, the participation of Chinese labor in Brazil is not allowed. And I think then the Chinese understand that well, and we have no problems in that direction. Indeed, we don't have, as far as I know, a One Belt, One Road initiative, because what you have were isolated projects in infrastructure. And now maybe there will be in Beijing by October, November, a meeting on the One Belt, One Road for Latin America. We will participate of that, and we are prepared to discuss projects that are mutually interesting.
I have one more question on your place in the world. One key international issue is the issue of global governance. Mm-hmm. Almost everyone agrees, for instance, that there is a need for reform at the United Nations, that perhaps the permanent members of the UN Security Council should be expanded. Brazil's been mentioned as one of those countries as well. What are Brazil's ideas on that and your hopes?
Our ideas are basically the assessment that the composition of the United Nations and its governance were designed just after the Second World War. And from that point until now, the world changed considerably, and there is a group of countries that are emerging economies or politically emerging, or countries who are fully developed that should participate more on a level playing field of the decision-making process. And the Security Council is an example of that. And we claim, I think it's a legitimate claim, that Brazil should be present in the Security Council on a permanent basis.
Right, I want to turn to domestic issues in Brazil for a moment. The country has gone through a period of political turmoil after the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff. Would you describe that as political? Was it legal? Was it a combination of both?
Brazil has been going through a difficult transition and 3 successive crises. Political first, which was a blockade, which led to the blockade of the decision-making process and led to the impeachment of President Dilma, an impeachment which was discussed and decided according fully in conformity with Brazilian laws and the Constitution. Brazil also went through, and partly because of the political blockade, an economic crisis, and we had a very big decrease in our GDP. And thirdly, we went through an ethic, a moral crisis, which was an epidemic corruption. But what is important is that, first, there has never been in Brazil a so serious, so widespread campaign against corruption as we did. And we keep having yet investigations, indictments, and trials. But what's important, it's striking, is that Brazil could go through such a difficult transition totally in conformity with our institutions. There's no violation. The executive branch is governing, the legislative branch is making laws, and including very difficult constitutional reforms, as in the case of the labor law. And the press is totally free. I think there are many countries that went through an extensive accumulation of crises totally in conformity and preserving their institutions.
President Temer himself is facing accusations of corruption. How is that being dealt with?
That's true. Indeed, he's been facing 2 accusations of corruption. But you have to take into account that the main instrument for this anti-corruption campaign was the adoption of plea bargain. That are declarations by people who are indicted, and they will have the alleviation of their fines if they tell whoever did that. And of course, this means a very important incentive in the context of the plea bargains to widespread accusations, but they have to be proved. There must be evidence of that, and that's what's at stake now in Brazil. Our accusations, and there are many, have to be proved.
Right. A year from now, Brazil will hold general elections, and these will be elections for the president. There will be state governors, all seats in the lower house, and 2/3 of the number of seats in the Senate as well. Do you expect there will be any major political realignments after this election? Do you see politics change?
I think there will be changes. I think there will be changes, and I think they are needed. For instance, we have 34 political parties. The '88 Constitution was a constitution of democracy and freedom. We have to have freedom for people to organize political parties. But with 34 parties, you cannot govern. There's no governance when you have to reconcile 34 different views. And one aspect may be the reduction of the number of parties. In it by itself is extremely important, because one of the sources of corruption was the need to co-opt some parties in order to govern. If you reduce the parties, you change the financing of elections, and you provide for some other changes in the electoral system, we certainly will have better conditions to consolidate these democratic elections.
So that's a major issue, this question of how you govern and governance with a coalition of that size. But what about domestic policy consideration? Things like, you have a huge population, just over 200 million. You have a very big wealth gap, income gap. What is being done to close that?
We have made considerable progress. You take in the first decades of this century, we adopted many important social programs. So programs of minimum income. This means distribution of resources for the poor to keep children at school. We are one of the very few countries in the world where the Constitution imposes to the government universal and free health and education. This is a very serious burden. This is responsible to a certain extent for the fiscal problems we have faced. But on the other hand, if you have a look at the social indicators, all of them are improving.
Former President Lula da Silva was sentenced to 9.5 years in prison for corruption. He's appealing that conviction, and he's now leading in the polls. Could this be a comeback?
The first issue is whether he's going to be condemned. If he's condemned, he's not going to be able to present himself at the election. But assuming that he is not indicted, he's not condemned, he can be, and he's a strong candidate. Indeed, the polls give him what the Labour Party or Lula himself used to have during previous polls or previous elections. The question is not only how much people tell they intend to vote on him and how much people tell they'll never vote for him.
How do you explain his popularity?
Lula is a smart politician, a warm personality. He was born in the midst of the poor regions of the northeast of Brazil. He understands the common people. He talks to them. He speaks their language. And he has governed with an agenda which is basically directed to the poorer groups of society.
Ambassador, thank you very much.
Welcome. Thank you.
That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.